We all know the story. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. With 3 small rickety ships, he stumbled upon the Americas. History tells us this was the start of the Age of Discovery. It was the moment Europe began its rule over the world. But what if I told you he was late? Almost half a century before Columbus was born, on the other side of the world, a true interstellar fleet was already ruling the oceans. While European kings struggled to gather a few hundred knights, this Eastern Empire launched an expeditionary force of 27,000 men. Their flagship was 120 meters long, 3 times the size of the largest European warship. It could fit Columbus's entire fleet inside its hull. On deck, they grew trees, raised pigs, and even brought back giraffes from Africa. In 1405, they possessed more naval tonnage than all of Europe, combined for the next 400 years. More importantly, they held the advanced technology of the era: magnetic compasses, watertight bulkheads, and deep-sea navigation. Technologies that Europe wouldn't fully master until the 16th century. This empire held the keys to the modern world. They could have colonized Australia. They could have circled the globe 4 centuries before the British Empire. But then, in one of the most baffling moments in human history, they stopped. They didn't lose a war. They didn't run out of money. They chose a systemic suicide. It wasn't a passive decline. It was an active choice to erase their own future. The root of this choice lay deep in the empire's institutional genes. They burned the fleet. They destroyed the nautical charts. They made it a capital crime to sail the open sea. This superpower slammed the door on the future, locking itself inside a prison made of stone walls and silver. Why? Why would a civilization at its peak choose to castrate itself? To find the answer, we have to look beyond the emperor on the throne. We have to look at a beggar who crawled out of hell, a financial storm that crossed the Pacific, and a perfect system that suffocated itself in the name of stability. This is the story of the Ming Dynasty. It is a fable about control, and it is a warning for the world today. To understand the tragedy, we must go back to where it started, or rather, back to hell. The year is 1344, the Huai River Basin, China. For a 16-year-old boy named Zhu Chongba, the world was ending. A catastrophic drought and plague swept through his village. In just 2 weeks, his father, his mother, and his eldest brother all starved to death. The future emperor was so poor he couldn't even afford a coffin. He wrapped his family's bodies in straw mats and buried them in a neighbor's field. To survive, he became a monk, then a beggar, wandering the shattered land for 3 years, suffering hunger and humiliation. But he saw more than just poverty. He saw how desperate, landless peasants rose up in rebellion. He saw how merchants and landlords hoarded grain while the people starved. This planted a deep belief in his soul. Mobility and commerce are the roots of chaos. Remember this moment, because those 3 years of wandering would decide the fate of China for the next 3 centuries. When this beggar finally defeated the warlords, drove the Mongols back to the steppe, and established the Great Ming Dynasty, he took the throne as the Hongwu Emperor. But deep inside, he was still that terrified boy watching his family die. He suffered from severe ruler's PTSD. He feared chaos. He feared movement. He feared anything he couldn't control. To prevent the tragedy of 1344 from happening again, he didn't just build a nation. He designed a massive, precision-engineered agricultural prison. In this system, he wanted time to stop. He assigned everyone a hukou, a lifelong fixed identity system. If you were a farmer, your sons, grandsons, and all your descendants would be farmers forever. If you were a craftsman, you would be a craftsman for eternity. Without the emperor's permission, traveling more than 30 miles from your hometown was a capital crime. He hated merchants. To him, they were parasitic, slippery, and unproductive. He even forbade them from wearing silk. Zhu Yuanzhang's dream was to turn China into a giant, self-sufficient rural commune. This system was designed to secure absolute power. By freezing the social structure, he hoped to eliminate rebellion. But this perfect stability also strangled the society's vitality and innovation. The system looked perfect in the 14th century. It brought peace. The population exploded. But the emperor failed to calculate one thing. The rules of the game were changing. Just as he tried to lock the gates, the waves of the ocean were already crashing against the door. And the man who would break his rules was his own son, 1402. A bloody civil war ended. Zhu Yuanzhang's fourth son, Zhu Di, seized the throne from his nephew. We must understand, Zhu Di was a usurper. In the traditional political logic of China, his reign was illegitimate. This made him deeply insecure. He needed to prove he was the chosen one more than any other emperor. If the Confucian scholars at home looked down on him, he would force the whole world to bow to him. And so, the most incredible engineering project in history began. Zhu Di ordered the construction of the fleet. This was a 15th century Hollywood blockbuster, but at its core it was tribute trade. The Ming gave away silk and porcelain worth far more than the tribute they received. The goal was shock and awe, to cement Zhu Di's power and silence his critics. In 1405, Zheng He, a 6-foot-tall Muslim eunuch with a steely gaze, led this fleet into the unknown. 300 ships, 27,800 men. The treasure ships were floating fortresses carrying the finest silks, porcelains, gunpowder, and the Ming's elite troops. When this fleet arrived in Southeast Asia, India, and even East Africa, the local kings were stunned. It was like an alien arrival. For rulers who refused to submit, like the king of Sri Lanka, Zheng He destroyed their armies and dragged them back to Beijing for trial. For those who cooperated, he showered them with silk and porcelain. In that era, China was the world. If history had followed this script, the global language today might be Chinese. Zheng He's fleet could have rounded the Cape of Good Hope, discovered Europe, or crossed the Pacific to the Americas. But inside this massive machine, a time bomb was ticking. The fleet was too expensive. This massive voyage had a fatal flaw. It generated no economic profit. Every expense relied on the national treasury, which was supported by the taxes of poor farmers. More importantly, it was a political project of the eunuchs. In the Ming power structure, two forces were locked in a death match. On one side, the eunuchs. They represented imperial power, expansion, and the ocean. On the other side, the scholar bureaucrats. They represented Confucian values, the landed gentry, and agriculture. Their goal was stability and low taxes. This clash was between imperial expansion and traditional landed interests. For the scholars, Zheng He's voyages were a nightmare. Not only did they waste silver, but they also gave the hated eunuchs control over the military and diplomacy. The ocean represented chaos. It represented commerce. It represented the collapse of the founding emperor's vision. They were waiting for a chance to shut down this expensive toy. Finally, that chance arrived. 1449, the Tumu Crisis. The Ming Emperor, Zhu Di's great-grandson, sought to emulate his ancestors' glory. He led a campaign against the Mongols, led by a corrupt eunuch. It was a disaster. The army was slaughtered. The emperor himself was captured by the Mongols. This was the Ming Dynasty's psychological breaking point. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Fear took over. The PTSD of the founding emperor returned to haunt the ruling class. The scholars seized the moment. They screamed, "The outside world is too dangerous. Come back, close the doors? They didn't just execute the eunuchs in charge. They did something that still haunts history to this day. The Minister of War, Liu Daxia, reportedly broke into the archives. He took the star charts, the ship blueprints, and the logs of Zheng He's 7 voyages and burned them all. But note this: the ban on the sea didn't bring peace. It manufactured chaos. The so-called Wokou pirate crisis in the 1500s was actually a direct result of the ban. By banning legal maritime trade, the Ming pushed coastal merchants into smuggling. The Japanese pirates were mostly desperate Chinese peasants forced into crime by their own government. But this only convinced the court that the ocean was evil. The conservatives won. Overnight, China went from an ocean hegemon to a turtle retreating into its shell. The Ming began frantically building the Great Wall. The walls we see today were mostly built in this era. Every brick was paid for by the budget that used to build ships. They naively thought that if they built the walls high enough, they could block out the danger. This Great Wall mentality was a direct extension of the agricultural prison system. It was a fear of the unknown, a rejection of commercial civilization. They blocked the explorers, they blocked the trade, they blocked the technology. In the meantime, Portugal was already rounding the Cape of Good Hope, upgrading their technology through exploration. While Europe embraced the ocean, the Ming ran in the opposite direction. They blocked everything, except one thing. One thing penetrated the borders like a virus and eventually rotted the empire from the inside out. That thing was silver. 1545, Potosi, Bolivia. The Spanish discovered a mountain of silver. It was the largest silver mine in human history. Thousands of indigenous peoples perished in the mines to extract it. You might ask, what does this have to do with the Ming Dynasty? Everything. At this time, the Ming faced a massive economic crisis. They had no money. The paper currency created by the Ming founder collapsed due to reckless overprinting. The economy needed hard cash. China had no silver mines, but China had silk, porcelain, and tea. And the Spanish, they had silver and an addiction to Chinese goods. And so a trade chain spanning the Pacific was born. The Manila Galleons. Silver from the Americas flooded through the Philippines and into China. 30% to 50% of the world's silver flowed into the Ming treasury and the vaults of wealthy southern merchants. It looked like a golden age. China became the factory of the world. The Ming government even launched a massive reform, the single whip reform. Taxes were no longer paid in grain or cloth, but exclusively in silver. But after the reformer died, the Wanli emperor abandoned his duties. For 30 years, he refused to hold court. Political factionalism tore the government apart. The reforms were rolled back, but the dependency on silver remained. The Ming had committed a fatal financial error. They handed their currency issuance rights to foreigners. Even worse, the rigid tax system meant the silver made the rich richer. The southern lands boomed with trade, yet the imperial government could not tax this wealth. The wealth of the empire disconnected from the state. In the mid-17th century, a perfect storm hit. First, the Little Ice Age. Northern China froze. Crops failed. Second, the 30 Years' War in Europe. Spain was crippled. The silver ships stopped coming. Third, Japan closed its borders, cutting off the other source of silver. These 3 factors triggered a terrifying deflationary spiral. Silver vanished from the market. The value of silver skyrocketed. For a peasant in the north, this was the apocalypse. He only had grain, but the government demanded silver. Before, 1 bag of rice equaled 1 ounce of silver. Now, 10 bags couldn't buy 1 ounce. Effectively, their taxes increased tenfold overnight. The South was still partying, drowning in wealth, but the North couldn't even afford bread. The peasants went bankrupt. They became refugees. Meanwhile, in Beijing, rival political factions fought for power. The officials cared only about their own profits, ignoring the dying people. The foundation was rotten. The emperor, Chongzhen, wanted to pay the army. He opened the treasury. It was empty. Rats were running inside. To save money, he made a small decision. He fired all the government couriers. He thought he was saving a few pennies. He didn't know that on the list of fired employees was a man named Li Zicheng, March 1644. Li Zicheng's rebel army surrounded Beijing. The Ming soldiers guarding the city walls hadn't received their pay for months. They opened the gates voluntarily. Emperor Chongzhen was diligent. He was anxious. He wanted to save the country, but he was cripplingly paranoid. He had his ablest generals executed and squandered the empire's last remaining strength. Despairing, he climbed Coal Hill, Meishan, just behind the Forbidden City. He looked down at his burning capital. He went to a gnarled old tree and hanged himself there. In his suicide note, he wrote, "My officials have failed me." Until the very end, he thought it was bad luck or bad ministers. He would never understand that the thing that killed the Ming wasn't the rebels. It wasn't the Manchus. It wasn't even the budget cuts. What killed the Ming was that afternoon, 200 years ago, when they burned the fleet. When the Ming chose to burn the ships and retreat to the land, they cut off their sensory organs. They thought they could survive as a safe, isolated island. But when the world connected through the oceans, when global financial waves could determine the life and death of an Eastern empire, isolation became a death sentence. The story of the Ming is a tragedy of opportunity cost. They didn't lose to an enemy. They lost to their own DNA. They lost to fear. They lost to a rejection of change. They possessed every tool to start the modern world, but they chose to erase their own future. For the next 500 years, the oceans belonged to Portugal, Spain, Holland, and Britain. These nations used exploration and trade to dominate the globe, while the once mighty Ming, and later the Qing, hid behind their walls, stagnating in isolation, until Western cannons smashed those doors open. History has no what-ifs. But looking back today, the ashes of that burned treasure fleet remain a searing scar on the Chinese nation. If the Ming hadn't given up the ocean, how do you think the world map would look today? Let us know in the comments.